February 3, 1942. Pearl Harbor's devastation still echoes through American consciousness as Lieutenant Commander Richard Bennett stands on a rain-soaked airfield in Norfolk, Virginia. 27 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers prepare for deployment to England, their aluminum skins gleaming under sporadic sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Bennett watches ground crews loading final equipment, knowing that statistically, only 11 of these majestic aircraft will complete their required 25 missions. The others will disappear into the cold European skies, taking their crews with them. "We're losing too many," he says quietly to Captain Elizabeth Harmon, the base's chief engineering officer. "Something has to change." Harmon nods, her clipboard pressed against her chest as protection from the persistent drizzle. "The boys deserve better odds than what we're giving them." Her voice carries the weight of countless telegrams she's watched being delivered to family members across America. Telegrams that transform parents into childless mourners and children into fatherless orphans with clinical military efficiency. By sunset, the bombers vanish into eastern clouds, their futures now entangled with the most improbable savior, a 39-year-old chemistry professor who had never seen combat, whose revolutionary idea would be dismissed as ridiculous, ignorant, even dangerously stupid by nearly every military expert who heard it. Within 6 months, that stupid idea would transform American bomber survival rates so dramatically that German intelligence officers would begin questioning whether the Americans had developed some kind of revolutionary armor technology. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more profound. Someone had finally understood what was hiding in plain sight. Rain continued falling as Professor Daniel Kaufman navigated the maze of temporary buildings that had transformed Massachusetts Institute of Technology into what students now called war tech. Temporary structures housed classified research projects where mathematicians calculated artillery trajectories, chemists developed new explosives, and engineers designed weapons that existed only in theoretical papers 6 months earlier. The campus hummed with purposeful energy despite the late hour. Lights burned in windows across the quadrangle as researchers driven by patriotic fervor and scientific curiosity worked around the clock. America's industrial might was legendary, but this war would be won as much by intellectual innovation as by manufacturing capacity. Kaufman's destination was Building 7B, a nondescript structure with blacked-out windows and armed Marines at every entrance. His security clearance, signed by Secretary of War Henry Stimson himself, granted him access to the newly formed Aircraft Vulnerability Assessment Team, a collection of academics and military personnel tasked with solving one of the war's most pressing problems: how to keep American bombers flying when German flak and fighters were tearing them apart. The guard checked his credentials with practiced efficiency, eyes lingering on the red-stamped priority access designation. "They're waiting for you, Professor," he said, returning the laminated card. "Third door on the left." Inside, Colonel William Hartley was already mid-briefing, his weathered face illuminated by overhead lights as he gestured toward photographs spread across tables. 20 civilians and military officers leaned forward, studying the images with expressions ranging from clinical detachment to barely concealed horror. "Gentlemen," Hartley said, acknowledging Kaufman's arrival with a nod, "these are our returning B-17s from last week's raids over Hamburg. As you can see, damage concentrations follow patterns we've been tracking for months." The photographs showed aircraft fuselages peppered with holes. Some had entire sections of wing missing. Others displayed damage so extensive that Kaufman wondered how they had remained airborne. Their B-17, designated Lucky Lady, had returned with 372 separate bullet and flak holes documented by ground crews. Its port wing resembled latticework rather than solid aluminum. Kaufman's eyes were drawn to a particularly haunting image: a ball turret gunner's position with the plexiglass shattered and the twin 50 caliber machine guns bent at unnatural angles. The accompanying report noted clinically, "Gunner S. Cesarnt. Martin Halloway survived with minor facial lacerations despite direct 20mm cannon impact." Major James Richardson, the Army Air Force's liaison to the research team, pointed to damage diagrams where red dots indicated bullet strikes. "Concentration remains consistent. Wings take approximately 41% of hits, rear fuselage 37%. the remainder distributed across midsections and occasionally the cockpit. He tapped a schematic drawing where additional armor plating had been outlined in blue pencil. We're proposing reinforcement here, here, and here, covering the areas showing highest damage concentration. Weight considerations mean we can only add approximately 400 pounds of additional armor without compromising aircraft performance. The question is optimal placement. Across the table, Dr. Evelyn Chen, a statistician from the University of Chicago whose theoretical work had revolutionized artillery targeting algorithms, frowned slightly. Kaufman noticed her expression and felt a momentary connection. Something about Richardson's presentation had triggered similar reactions in both of them. The armor distribution makes sense based on observed damage patterns, Richardson continued. We've already begun fabrication of plates that can be retrofitted to aircraft already in theater. Implementation begins next month. How many missions are these aircraft completing before loss? Kaufman asked, speaking for the first time since entering. Richardson consulted his notes. Average bomber completes 11.7 missions before being shot down. Our objective is 25 missions per aircraft. Crew replacement rates are currently unsustainable. And what's the primary cause of loss when we can determine it? Kaufman continued, his voice carrying the quiet precision of someone accustomed to scientific inquiry. Multiple factors, Richardson replied. Direct fighter attack accounts for approximately 38%, flak approximately 27%, the remainder attributed to combined damage effects, mechanical failure under combat stress, or unknown factors when aircraft simply fail to return. Kaufman nodded, staring at the photographs with an intensity that made those nearby uncomfortable. The silence stretched until Colonel Hartley cleared his throat. Professor Kaufman, you have something to add? I'm not sure yet, Kaufman replied, still studying the damage patterns. May I ask, are these photographs representative of all returning aircraft? Absolutely, Richardson confirmed. We've documented over 700 returning bombers. The damage patterns are remarkably consistent. And these are all aircraft that return to base, Kaufman said, more statement than question. Obviously, Richardson replied with slight impatience, we can't exactly photograph the ones that don't make it back. The room filled with uncomfortable laughter that died when Kaufman looked up, his expression grave. Then we have a fundamental problem with our analysis. Colonel Hartley's eyebrows rose. Explain. We're looking at the survivors, Kaufman said, walking to the largest photograph, a B-17 with its rear stabilizer nearly severed by cannon fire. These aircraft made it home despite their damage. What about the ones that didn't? The room fell silent as implications rippled through the assembled experts. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, her eyes widening with recognition. The damage we're seeing, Kaufman continued, tracing bullet holes clustered along a wing section, tells us where a bomber can be hit and still return. It tells us nothing about where it can't afford to be hit. Richardson scoffed. That's obvious. We know aircraft go down when they take critical hits to engines, pilot, or control surfaces. Do we? Kaufman challenged. Or are we assuming? Because these photographs suggest something quite different. He gestured to the diagram where Richardson had outlined proposed armor placements. You're reinforcing areas that demonstrably can sustain damage without catastrophic failure. Because that's where they're getting hit most often, Richardson countered, his voice rising slightly. No, Kaufman said quietly. That's where surviving aircraft are getting hit. What if the aircraft we never see again are being hit somewhere else? Somewhere that doesn't show in our data, because those hits are fatal. The distinction hung in the air like smoke. Dr. Chen was the first to break the silence. Selection bias, she said. We're analyzing a pre-selected sample that survived because their damage was sustainable. Exactly, Kaufman said. We're looking at where German gunners are hitting our aircraft and missing the critical question. Where are they hitting the bombers that don't come back? Colonel Hartley leaned forward. You're suggesting we've been interpreting the evidence backward. I'm suggesting, Kaufman said carefully, that absence of evidence is sometimes the most important evidence of all. Over the next 3 hours, Kaufman and Chen led the team through a complete reassessment of their approach. Where traditional military wisdom had seen damage patterns as indicators of vulnerability requiring reinforcement, they now considered an alternative hypothesis. Perhaps these were exactly the areas that didn't need additional protection. In the corner of the room, Lieutenant Walter Freeman, a former B-17 pilot whose right arm ended at the elbow, courtesy of a Messerschmitt attack over Bremen, listened with growing excitement. "I've seen planes limping home with half their tail surfaces gone," he offered, "but I've never seen one return with a severed control cable run." His practical experience provided crucial validation to Kaufmann's theoretical insight. As midnight approached, the team began mapping the aircraft systems that almost never appeared in damage reports, not because they weren't being hit, but because when they were hit, the aircraft didn't survive to be photographed. Major Richardson remained skeptical. "So you're suggesting we ignore the most common damage sites and instead armor the areas showing minimal damage?" "I'm suggesting," Kaufmann replied patiently, "that areas showing minimal damage on returning aircraft might be precisely the areas where damage proves fatal. If a bomber can take 300 hits to its wings and still fly, the wings aren't the vulnerability." Dr. Chen approached a world map where pins marked the last known positions of aircraft lost over enemy territory. "We need to reverse our thinking. Instead of asking where returning aircraft are damaged, we should ask what damage don't we see on returning aircraft." The conceptual reversal fell like a thunderclap across the room. Colonel Hartley ordered all armor placement plans suspended, pending further analysis. Within 48 hours, the team had compiled a new damage assessment methodology that categorized aircraft systems by their absence from damage reports rather than their presence. They worked without interruption, subsisting on coffee and sandwiches delivered by administrative staff who had no idea that the papers scattered across the conference room tables might save thousands of lives. Kaufmann, who had arrived as an academic outsider, found his perspective increasingly central to the analytical process. Lieutenant Freeman proved invaluable, drawing on his combat experience to identify systems that, when compromised, left crews with no chance of survival. "The hydraulic lines running beneath the navigator's station," he noted, sketching on a technical diagram. "When those get hit, you lose aileron control. The bird rolls, and there's nothing you can do to recover." The findings were startling. While wing surfaces and rear fuselages showed extensive damage on returning aircraft, several critical areas showed almost none: the control cables running beneath the cockpit floor, the narrow connecting struts between the cockpit and bomb bay, and, most significantly, the fuel line junctions where multiple feeds connected to engines. "They're not showing damage," Dr. Chen explained to a now expanded briefing 3 days later, "because aircraft hit in these areas don't come back. A bomber can lose substantial portions of its wing and still maintain flight. It cannot lose control cable functionality or fuel system integrity." Lieutenant Commander Bennett, newly assigned as implementation coordinator, studied the revised armor placement diagrams with open skepticism. "You're proposing we leave the most frequently damaged areas unprotected?" "No," Kaufmann corrected. "We're proposing we prioritize protecting the areas that, when damaged, prevent aircraft from returning at all. The wings and fuselage are already surprisingly resilient. The evidence is right here in these photographs, but these other systems have no redundancy." "It goes against everything we know about aircraft protection," Bennett objected. "Sometimes the most valuable knowledge is recognizing when everything we know is wrong," Kaufmann replied. The meeting ended without consensus, but word of the unorthodox analysis reached General Curtis LeMay, whose pragmatic approach to bomber operations had already established him as a commander who valued results over tradition. After reviewing the statistical analysis, he authorized a test implementation on 50 B-17 bombers deploying to England the following month. The authorization memo, bearing LeMay's distinctive signature, contained a handwritten note that would later be framed in the Aircraft Vulnerability Assessment Team's headquarters. "If Professor Kaufmann is right, we save crews. If he's wrong, we are no worse off than we are now. Proceed immediately." The modifications were completed in 3 weeks of round-the-clock work at manufacturing facilities across 3 states. Rather than covering wings and rear fuselages with heavy armor plate, the revised protection scheme concentrated on narrow, precisely defined areas: control cable runs, pilot compartment floors, fuel line junctions, and the previously unarmored sections connecting the cockpit to bomb bays. The total weight remained within the 400-pound limit, but its distribution changed dramatically. At the Lockheed Modification Center in Burbank, California, lead engineer Howard Mitchell initially refused to implement the specifications. "These make no sense," he told his foreman, holding up the technical drawings. They want us to leave the most vulnerable areas exposed, while armoring sections that hardly ever show damage. Only a direct call from Colonel Hartley's office, emphasizing the classification level of the project, convinced him to proceed. "If these modifications get men killed," Mitchell warned, "it won't be my responsibility." On April 7, 1943, the first squadron of modified B-17s arrived at RAF Kimballton. Ground crews accustomed to applying armor according to traditional vulnerability assessments were bewildered by the new configuration. Captain Thomas Whitaker, the squadron's chief maintenance officer, called the modifications the dumbest thing I've seen since this war began. His opinion was shared by many. Pilots inspecting their aircraft expressed alarm at seeing traditional danger zones left with minimal additional protection, while obscure components received elaborate armoring. Lieutenant Robert Donovan, piloting Carolina Ghost, told his navigator the modifications made him feel like, "We're wearing a helmet on our foot and leaving our head bare." Despite their misgivings, the squadron prepared for combat operations under strict orders from 8th Air Force Headquarters to maintain the modified protection scheme without alterations. Engineering officers from MIT arrived to ensure the armor remained exactly as specified, overriding local maintenance chiefs who attempted to correct what they perceived as obvious errors. On April 12th, the squadron participated in a raid against industrial targets in Bremen, Germany. Of 18 aircraft that reached the target area, 17 returned to base, a survival rate that drew notice but remained within statistical variation. Over the next 3 operations, however, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The modified bombers were returning at a rate of 89% compared to the theater average of 67%. Captain Whitaker's maintenance crews began documenting extraordinary cases of survival. Carolina Ghost returned from its 3rd mission with its port wing so damaged that conventional wisdom said it should have separated in flight. Yet the aircraft remained controllable because the control linkages, now protected by Kaufman's armor scheme, remained intact. After the 5th mission, when all 16 aircraft returned despite weather conditions and fighter opposition that had decimated other groups, Captain Whitaker requested a direct call with Professor Kaufman. "Whatever you did," he said when the connection was established, "it's working. I've never seen anything like it." By the 10th mission, German intelligence analysts had taken note of the unusual survivability of the specific squadron. Luftwaffe pilot interrogations included new questions about American armor technology, with officers particularly interested in reports of aircraft sustaining damage that would have downed previous bomber models. Oberleutnant Klaus Weber, captured after his Messerschmitt was shot down near Dunkirk, reported during interrogation, "The new American bombers refuse to fall. We hit them where we always hit them, and they keep flying. It's as if they've developed some kind of special protection we can't see." In reality, the protection was exactly what couldn't be seen, a fundamental rethinking of vulnerability based on absence rather than presence. At RAF Kimballton, Captain Whitaker's opinion had undergone a transformation as dramatic as the survival statistics. "Whatever madman came up with this," he told a visiting congressional delegation, "deserves every medal we've got. These birds are coming home with damage that should have put them in the Channel." The delegation included Senator Arthur Vandenberg, whose initial skepticism about academic interference in military matters had been a significant obstacle to the program's funding. Standing in a maintenance hangar, surrounded by aircraft that conventional wisdom said should never have returned, the senator could only shake his head in amazement. "I've been wrong before," he admitted to Colonel Hartley, "but rarely this dramatically wrong. How soon can we implement this across the entire bomber force?" Detailed analysis of the returning modified aircraft revealed the truth of his statement. Carolina Ghost returned from its 6th mission with 427 documented damage points, including an entire section of vertical stabilizer missing and a 3-foot hole through its starboard wing. Despite catastrophic damage to areas previously considered critical, the aircraft remained controllable because its core systems, those identified by Kaufman and Chen's inverted analysis, remained intact. As word spread through bomber groups, pilots began requesting transfers to squadrons equipped with the modified aircraft. The skepticism that had greeted the initial deployments transformed into desperate demand as crews recognized that the stupid armor placement was keeping their comrades alive. By July 1943, all new production B-17s incorporated the revised protection scheme. Retrofit kits were shipped to European bases with urgent implementation orders. General LeMay, reviewing the preliminary results, authorized expansion of the program to include B-24 Liberators and, eventually, B-29 Superfortresses being prepared for Pacific operations. The statistical impact became increasingly clear as larger samples accumulated. Aircraft completing their full 25 mission requirements rose from 24% to 51%. Crew survival rates improved correspondingly, addressing one of the most critical personnel issues facing the Army Air Forces, the unsustainable loss of trained aircrews. At an airbase in East Anglia, the transformation was measured not in statistics, but in human terms. Mess halls that had been half empty as crews disappeared over Europe now buzzed with conversation. Barracks that ground crews had become accustomed to clearing out every few weeks, packing personal belongings for shipment to grieving families, now maintained stable occupancy. Captain Michael Reynolds, a chaplain assigned to the 491st Bomb Group, noted in his monthly report that he had conducted only 7 memorial services in September, down from 23 during the same month the previous year. "The men know something has changed," he wrote. "They speak of Professor Kaufman's armor as if it were divine intervention." Colonel Hartley, presenting findings to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in August, described the modified protection scheme as the simplest yet most profound improvement in aircraft survivability since the adoption of self-sealing fuel tanks. His presentation included before and after photographs of identical damage scenarios. In the before cases, aircraft had been lost when unprotected control systems failed. In the after cases, bombers returned safely despite sometimes more extensive external damage, because the critical systems remained functional. "We were solving the wrong problem," he concluded. "We were protecting aircraft from the damage we could see, rather than the damage that was actually proving fatal." The success carried profound implications beyond immediate survival rates. The psychological impact on crews proved equally significant. Pilots and navigators who understood the statistical foundation behind their protection reported higher confidence in their aircraft, directly affecting operational decision-making during combat. Captain Michael Donoghue, whose crew completed 31 missions in Iron Lady, described how the knowledge changed his approach. "Knowing our critical systems were protected, we could take risks when necessary. When we took hits, I had concrete reasons to believe we could make it home, instead of just hope and prayer." Flight surgeons documented reduced psychological casualties among crews flying the modified aircraft. The debilitating anxiety that had previously grounded experienced airmen decreased significantly when crews believed their aircraft incorporated protection based on scientific analysis rather than traditional assumptions. Dr. Howard Kingsley, Chief Psychiatric Consultant to the 8th Air Force, noted, "The Kaufman modifications have proven as important to mental resilience as to physical survivability. Crews who believe their protection is based on comprehensive analysis rather than guesswork demonstrate markedly improved stress tolerance." The transformation extended beyond bomber operations into broader military analysis. The conceptual breakthrough, focusing on unseen evidence rather than obvious patterns, began influencing approaches to naval protection, ground force armor distribution, and eventually post-war civilian safety systems. Yet, despite the success, the fundamental insight remained counterintuitive enough that Kaufman frequently found himself re-explaining the concept to new officers rotating through command positions. "The natural human tendency," he noted in a 1945 lecture to Army engineering officers, "is to respond to the most visible problems. We reinforce what we can see is being attacked. But sometimes the most important vulnerabilities are precisely those we never witness because they result in catastrophic failure. We must learn to look not just at what the evidence shows, but what it conspicuously fails to show." Kaufman's absent evidence methodology eventually received formal recognition when the Statistical Research Office incorporated it into standard assessment protocols. The technique became known informally as Kaufman's inversion and later, more academically, as survivorship bias analysis. On a personal level, Kaufman found the recognition gratifying but secondary to the practical impact. During a rare visit to RAF Kimballton, in the spring of 1944. He met crews who attributed their survival directly to his analytical approach. The encounter affected him profoundly. "I've spent my career manipulating abstract variables," he wrote to Dr. Chen afterward. "To shake hands with young men who are alive because of a statistical insight, that gives meaning to mathematics I never anticipated." By war's end, over 7,000 American bombers had been modified using the approach. Conservative estimates suggested the survivability improvements saved between 8,000 and 10,000 airmen, who would otherwise have been lost over enemy territory. The implementation wasn't without challenges. Manufacturing priorities constantly shifted with frontline demands, creating production bottlenecks that sometimes delayed modification kits. At maintenance facilities closer to combat operations, specialized training requirements sometimes meant crews improvised installations that deviated from optimal designs. Technical Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, supervising B-17 modifications at RAF Bassingbourn, developed adaptation techniques that became standard throughout the 8th Air Force. "The professor's design makes perfect sense on paper," she explained during a training session, "but paper doesn't have to fit between hydraulic lines in freezing conditions. We've learned how to maintain the protection principles while adapting to each aircraft's peculiarities." Her pragmatic approach exemplified the successful marriage between theoretical statistical analysis and practical application that characterized the program's implementation. The modifications required precision that balanced vulnerability reduction against maintenance accessibility and operational requirements. "The statistical approach makes our job harder," Rodriguez acknowledged, "but the aircraft come back more often with crews intact. That's worth any amount of extra work." The broader transformation extended into systematic changes in how military planners approached problems involving incomplete information. Kaufman's methodology demonstrated that statistical inference could reveal patterns hidden within operational data, with applications ranging from convoy routing to ammunition allocation. The statistical research groups found themselves consulting on challenges spanning every domain of modern warfare. Major William Preston, commanding bomber formations equipped with the optimized protection, observed changes in crew confidence that reflected more than hardware improvements. Crews flying modified aircraft report increased morale knowing their protection was designed through scientific analysis rather than conventional assumptions. They trust their planes in ways previous crews never could. This psychological impact complemented measurable improvements in survival rates, creating operational advantages beyond pure vulnerability reduction. The statistical validation accumulated through mission reports documenting survival across different aircraft configurations and operational conditions. By early 1944, bombers equipped with the new armor showed improvements that justified the methodology even to initially skeptical combat commanders. During the intensive operations preceding D-Day, when the 8th Air Force flew maximum effort missions against transportation targets across occupied France, aircraft modified according to Kaufman's specifications demonstrated superior survival under the most demanding conditions. Mission planners who had questioned mathematical approaches now requested additional aircraft equipped with the scientifically optimized protection. Practical validation silenced theoretical objections more effectively than academic arguments ever could. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, created conditions that multiplied the benefits of improved bomber survivability. Aircraft that survived initial attacks long enough for escort fighters to intervene were far more likely to complete their missions. Kaufman's analysis had anticipated this synergy, designing protection systems that maximized survivability during critical moments when escort coverage was absent or engaged with enemy fighters. Dr. Chen coordinated between analysts and operational commanders who recognized that scientific methodology could transform military planning. The Statistical Research Group's success established operational research as essential to modern warfare, creating demand for mathematical analysis across every aspect of military operations. Universities across America developed programs training the operational analysts who would reshape post-war approaches to complex organizational problems. The human impact became visible through aircrew testimonials documenting survival in circumstances that would have been fatal under previous configurations. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison, whose combat experience had made him skeptical of theoretical approaches, became an advocate for expanded implementation. "The mathematics saved my crew," he stated during a War Department briefing. "We took engine hits that should have ended the mission, but the critical systems remained functional." The difference between theory and reality disappeared the moment those bullets started flying. By late 1944, the combined effects of improved protection, fighter escort, and tactical evolution had reduced bomber loss rates to levels that made strategic bombing operations sustainable. The transformation represented more than technological improvement. It demonstrated how mathematical reasoning could solve problems conventional approaches failed to address effectively. Kaufman's insight about survivorship bias became a cornerstone of modern operational analysis. The idea that the most important data might be precisely what's missing from your sample revolutionized approaches to everything from medical research to business strategy. The broader implications extended into post-war applications, reshaping organizational approaches to problems involving incomplete information. Medical researchers adopted techniques developed for aircraft vulnerability to understand treatment effectiveness, where patient outcomes provided biased samples. Business analysts applied survivorship bias methodology to market research that could be distorted by focusing only on successful companies while ignoring failures providing crucial information. As peacetime industries converted from military to civilian production, the principles established by the Aircraft Vulnerability Assessment Team found applications in automobile safety, chemical plant design, and civil aviation. Engineers who had worked on bomber protection systems applied similar analytical approaches to identifying critical vulnerabilities in civilian infrastructure, often with equally dramatic results. Harold Dennison, who had served as a junior analyst under Kaufman, later revolutionized automobile safety testing by applying survivorship bias analysis to crash statistics. "We were making the same mistake with car designs that we initially made with bombers," he explained to automotive executives in 1953. "We were studying the crashes where occupants survived rather than identifying what made other crashes fatal." His work led directly to reinforced passenger compartments, collapsible steering columns, and padded dashboards that saved countless lives in the decades that followed. Kaufman continued his work with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose abstract reasoning had translated into tangible improvements in human survival. His 8 technical memoranda became foundational documents in operational research, establishing methodologies influencing decision-making across domains far removed from aircraft armor placement. The war's progression toward Allied victory validated approaches combining mathematical rigor with operational experience, demonstrating that scientific methodology could enhance rather than replace practical knowledge. Combat veterans and mathematical analysts learned to collaborate effectively, creating frameworks incorporating both empirical observation and statistical inference. Their partnership suggested possibilities for post-war applications where complex problems required both practical experience and theoretical sophistication. As 1945 drew toward conclusion, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved objectives that seemed impossible following Pearl Harbor. American bombers flew deep into enemy airspace with survival rates that made sustained operations feasible, protected by armor configurations prioritizing areas where mathematics, rather than conventional wisdom, suggested vulnerability existed. The transformation represented victory not just for Allied military planning, but for scientific reasoning applied to problems of life and death consequence. Decades later, the principle Kaufman identified would be taught in business schools, medical research programs, and engineering curriculum worldwide. What began as a stupid idea that contradicted military convention had become one of the war's most profound analytical breakthroughs, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable insights come from questioning what seems obviously true. Standing on that rain-soaked airfield in 1942, Lieutenant Commander Bennett could never have imagined that the solution to his desperate observation, "We're losing too many," would come not from heavier armor or faster aircraft, but from a fundamental rethinking of how evidence itself should be interpreted. The absence of bullet holes proved more important than their presence, and in that paradoxical insight lay the salvation of thousands of young airmen who would otherwise have disappeared into history. In the decades following World War II, Kaufman's insight continued influencing fields far beyond military aviation. Highway safety engineers applied survivorship bias analysis to accident patterns, recognizing that examining only vehicles that reached repair shops created misleading data about crash survival factors. Medical researchers investigating treatment efficacy began controlling for patient selection effects that might skew clinical results. Corporate strategists recognized that studying only successful businesses created fundamental misunderstandings about what factors truly determined organizational survival. The concept found particular resonance in pharmaceutical research, where early drug trials frequently suffered from unrecognized selection biases. Dr. Eleanor Simmons, whose groundbreaking work in cardiac treatment methodology built directly on Kaufman's principles, described the connection. "We were making the same mistake the military initially made, studying only the survivors. By recognizing how selection bias distorts evidence, we fundamentally changed how clinical effectiveness is evaluated." Throughout the 1950s and 60s, academic interest in survivorship bias remained primarily confined to specialized fields of statistics and operations research. But as analytical methods grew more sophisticated in the 1970s, Kaufman's insight began appearing in disciplines ranging from evolutionary biology to financial market analysis. At Harvard Business School, Professor James Westmoreland incorporated survivorship bias analysis into what became the standard methodology for evaluating market competition. "When we study only successful companies," he explained to incoming MBA candidates, "we're looking at the bombers that made it back. The truly instructive cases are often the failures that never make it into our business case studies." His approach transformed how business researchers examined corporate performance, leading to recognition that many commonly accepted success factors were actually present in failed companies at similar rates. They simply weren't being studied because those companies no longer existed to be examined. The principle proved particularly valuable during the rapid technological transformations of the 1980s and 90s, when investment strategies frequently suffered from focusing exclusively on visible successes while ignoring instructive failures. Venture capital firms that incorporated survivorship bias analysis into their evaluation methodologies demonstrated significantly improved long-term returns by systematically examining why promising startups failed rather than studying only unicorn successes. During the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, investment firms that maintained Kaufman-inspired analytical protocols avoided the worst market excesses by recognizing that successful internet companies represented a heavily filtered sample that obscured critical vulnerability factors. When the market collapsed in 2000, these firms suffered far less than competitors who had based investment strategies on studying only the characteristics of apparent winners. Perhaps most poignantly, the insight that saved bomber crews eventually found its way back to aviation safety. When commercial airlines began systematic analysis of near-miss incidents rather than focusing exclusively on actual crashes, the resulting safety improvements dramatically reduced accident rates. The modern commercial aviation safety record, making air travel statistically safer than almost any other form of transportation, owes a direct methodological debt to Kaufman's wartime insight. In 1973, when the newly formed National Transportation Safety Board implemented mandatory reporting of incidents, events that could have led to accidents but didn't, they explicitly cited the bomber armor case as methodological precedent. By studying close calls rather than just disasters, safety engineers identified critical vulnerabilities that might otherwise have remained invisible until catastrophic failures occurred. The original armor placement records were eventually declassified in 1976, allowing full academic analysis of the program's impact. Statistical modeling suggested the modified protection scheme had saved between 11,000 and 14,000 airmen over the final 2 years of European operations. Young men who returned home to build families, careers, and communities that would otherwise never have existed. One such airman, Technical Sergeant David Abramowitz, whose B-17 Desert Flower survived a direct attack by 7 German fighters during a mission over Schweinfurt, later became a high school mathematics teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico. For 43 years, he began each semester by describing how statistical thinking had saved his life and the lives of his crewmates. "I'm standing here today he would tell wide-eyed students who rarely associated mathematics with survival, because someone was smart enough to look for what wasn't there instead of only what was. Remember that when you think mathematics doesn't matter to real life. His story affected generations of students, some of whom went on to careers in engineering, medicine, and data science. Among them was Maria Vasquez, who developed statistical methods for identifying early-stage pancreatic cancer when traditional symptom-based approaches failed. Her screening protocol, which looked for subtle absences in blood chemistry patterns rather than obvious presence of markers, saved thousands of lives through early detection of a disease traditionally diagnosed too late for effective intervention. "I was thinking about Mr. Abramovitz's bomber story," she explained when asked about her methodological breakthrough. "Sometimes what's missing from your data tells you more than what's present." The most profound legacy, however, may be philosophical rather than technical. Kaufman's insight demonstrated how easily human perception can be distorted by selective evidence, how our natural tendency to focus on the obvious and visible can blind us to critical factors hidden by their very absence. The concept has influenced fields ranging from behavioral economics to cognitive psychology, becoming a cornerstone example of how human reasoning can be systematically improved by recognizing its inherent limitations. Cognitive scientists have documented how survivorship bias operates as a fundamental feature of human perception, rather than simply a statistical error. We naturally construct understanding from the evidence available to us, rarely accounting for systematic distortions in what information reaches our awareness in the first place. When Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky developed their groundbreaking work on cognitive biases in the 1970s, research that would eventually win a Nobel Prize, they cited the bomber armor case as one of the clearest historical examples of how intelligent people systematically misinterpret evidence when selection effects remain unrecognized. "What makes the bomber example so powerful," Kahneman noted in a 1997 lecture, "is that the mistake is simultaneously obvious once explained and yet nearly universal before explanation. It reveals something fundamental about how human minds process evidence." In their landmark paper, Judgment Under Uncertainty, Kahneman and Tversky demonstrated that survivorship bias operates not just in specialized statistical contexts, but in everyday reasoning across virtually all domains of human judgment. The bomber armor case became a canonical example used in psychology textbooks worldwide to illustrate how even highly intelligent individuals systematically misinterpret evidence when they fail to account for how that evidence reached them. The story's power comes partly from its simplicity. The absent bullet holes told the real story, yet that simplicity belies the profound challenges of consistently applying the insight across domains where selection effects operate more subtly. Recognition of survivorship bias has become a fundamental analytical tool precisely because the bias itself proves so persistent and difficult to eliminate without conscious methodological safeguards. Captain Elizabeth Harmon, who had stood beside Bennett on that rain-soaked airfield in 1942, eventually became the first female department chair in aeronautical engineering at Purdue University. Throughout her distinguished academic career, she kept a small framed photograph of a bullet-riddled B-17 on her office wall. When students asked about its significance, she would smile slightly before answering, "It reminds me that sometimes the most important evidence is what you don't see." That paradoxical wisdom, that absence can be more revealing than presence, remains perhaps the most enduring legacy of what military officers initially dismissed as a stupid idea. In questioning the obvious interpretation of battle damage, Kaufman and Chen had demonstrated a principle that extends far beyond aircraft protection into the fundamental nature of evidence itself. Their insight reminds us that wisdom sometimes lies not in accepting what evidence most obviously suggests, but in questioning what that evidence might be systematically missing. In recognizing that limitation, they not only saved thousands of young airmen, but established an analytical principle that continues saving lives across domains ranging from highway safety to pharmaceutical research. Today, survivorship bias stands as a cautionary reminder that our most dangerous analytical errors often come not from misinterpreting the evidence we see, but from failing to recognize the evidence we never get the chance to observe. The bullet holes that never returned to base told the most important story, if only someone was wise enough to notice their absence. In that recognition lies a broader truth about human knowledge itself. Sometimes understanding requires us to see beyond what's visible to what should be there but isn't. It requires us to recognize that our perspective may be systematically limited in ways that distort our most basic interpretations of reality. As Dr. Chen noted in her final wartime report, the most dangerous misinterpretations are those where the missing evidence is invisible precisely because of the phenomenon we're trying to understand. We must learn to look not just at what survived to reach our analysis, but what systematic forces might have prevented certain evidence from ever appearing before us. That insight, simple yet profound, continues illuminating fields far beyond its wartime origins, reminding us that sometimes the most important data points are the ones that never make it into our databases. The absence of evidence, when properly understood, can indeed be evidence itself, a principle that transformed stupid into brilliant and continues saving lives decades after armor plating was first redirected to protect the vulnerabilities we couldn't see. The capacity to recognize what systematic forces might be hiding from our view, to look beyond the survivors, to understand what happened to those who didn't make it into our samples, remains one of the most powerful analytical tools across domains, ranging from medicine to economics. What began as a counterintuitive approach to bomber protection has become nothing less than a fundamental principle of sound reasoning itself. In the final analysis, Kaufman's stupid idea reminds us that true innovation often requires challenging our most basic assumptions, questioning not just our answers, but the very way we frame our questions. By looking beyond the obvious to see what wasn't there, he didn't just save bombers, he revealed how easily our minds can be misled by what seems self-evidently true. And perhaps that is the most profound legacy, the recognition that wisdom sometimes begins not with brilliant insight, but with the willingness to question what everyone else considers obvious.